Do you have to believe anything to be Jewish? Some people say that Judaism is a religion of deeds, but not creeds. It's about obeying mitzvot, doing good deeds, and not about believing in a God or in revelation or in the soul, in immortality, in an afterlife. It's just about doing good things. Well, the reality is that Jewish life is mixed. Some people believe those things. Some people don't believe those things. Some people believe the traditional ideas sometimes and not other times. And some people pick and choose what they believe out of that canon of traditional Jewish theology. Historically, Judaism was an ethno-religion. It was a combination of who you were, your ethnic identity and your culture, and your beliefs and your practices and your religious community, your sense of the universe, as well as your sense of yourself. So when you're an ethno-religion, there's an assumption that everyone who is that ethnicity believes that religion, or at least that was the case before modern times. In the last couple of centuries, things have really changed. Before the last couple of centuries, before the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, the arguments between Christians, Muslims, and Jews were simply over the right understanding of a similar kind of God. They all believed in a similar kind of God, but they just disagreed on particulars of that God, a God that was omnipotent, a God that was engaged in the universe. So I'll read to you one summary of that vision of a God. God who is a creator, the one who creates and sustains the world, who is transcendent, apart from creation, yet immanent, ever present in the creation. So you have God the creator, God the revealer, the one who gives us not only the material world, but a written word, Torah, New Testament, Quran, that complements natural law with moral law. So God the creator and God the revealer. God the redeemer, the one who is active in history, shaping events with a plan we may only partially see, caring for all humanity, but in a special covenant with fill in the blank, right? Whatever your sect is. God the creator, God the revealer, God the redeemer, and God the ruler, the one in a personal relationship with each of us and in communal relationship with all of us in that chosen community. And finally, God the judge, the one who makes an accounting of every human being and decrees our destiny. So you have God the creator, the revealer, the redeemer, the ruler, the judge. This is a God involved in the world, a personality that cares what you eat and what you wear and whom you love and whether you obey what he wants you to do in the book that he gave you. All these religions agreed on those basic principles. They just disagreed on what the book was and what you're supposed to do and who the chosen community was. And of course, enter the scientific revolution, enter the Enlightenment, and all these ideas began to be in doubt. Is there really a judge who cares what I eat and what I wear? Is there really a cosmic God of the entire huge, vast universe that we see through telescopes that cares about me and what I eat? Is there really a God active in history who's rewarding the righteous and punishing the wicked and privileging a particular people? Do you even need a God who created everything, or are there other theories like evolution that might explain how things came to be? With all these ideas in doubt, there's all kinds of questions raised about that ethno-religious Jewish identity. Because if the religion is changing, what does that mean about the ethnic identity? Can I do the ethnic identity without that traditional religion, or are they inseparable one from the other? And today, Jews tend not to talk too much about what they believe, in part because I don't think the establishment would like the answers they would get if they asked the questions. So here's one example. The Pew Forum on Religion and American Life asked a series of questions about life after death. Do you believe with absolute certainty in life after death? More than half of all Christians said yes. Only 16% of Jews agreed. Is there a heaven where good people are rewarded? 3/4 of all Christians said yes. Only 38% of Jews agreed. Is there a hell where bad people are punished? 2/3 of Christians said yes. Only 22% of Jews concurred. So Jews don't necessarily believe the words they're saying in synagogue, because clearly there's an afterlife in Jewish life, as we'll see. Clearly there's a judgment time. There's even a sense of a resurrection of the dead, a heaven and a hell in traditional Jewish theology, and even a purgatory, believe it or not. We'll see an example of that. But Jews tend not to believe it. And so then you run into a problem, because Jewish culture was developed by people who believed all those things. Jewish rituals, Jewish liturgy, the prayer book, the Talmud, the Torah. And so here an author describes what he calls cognitive dissonance. You could call it Jewish cognitive dissonance. We know that something is askew, but we avoid thinking about it. We know that we are being inconsistent, but we avoid confronting it. For example, we attend prayer services, at least on the high holidays, but don't believe the words. We light the Hanukkah candles, but don't believe the miracle. We pray for this or that, despite not believing in the efficacy of prayer. We may feel certain of our belief in God in one moment, then get frustrated and throw up our hands and say, I don't know what to believe, or I don't know if I believe. In 2023, a Reform rabbi named Barry Schwartz issued a new book. It's called Open Judaism, a guide for believers, atheists, and agnostics. Barry Schwartz, for many years, was the editor of the Jewish Publication Society and also a congregational rabbi. And I found this book to be very interesting because he explicitly includes, you can even see in the title, Jewish atheists, which includes humanists, as part of his pluralistic approach. And he takes a very refreshing attitude towards it when he talks about the question of authenticity and Judaism. This is from his preface. Jews have disagreed about the existence of God, the nature of God, the revelation at Sinai, the definition of who is a Jew, and just about everything. No one particular understanding of traditional Judaism should be mistaken for authentic Judaism. Indeed, I would argue, there is no one practice of Judaism that should be considered authentic or authoritative. Music to my ears. The idea that there's no one way to do Jewish or to be Jewish or to celebrate Judaism or to believe as a Jew is exactly one of the core principles of our humanistic approach to Jewish life. And so for our next few adult ed sessions, today and the next week and the following week, we'll be exploring some of the topics that Schwartz covers in his book. Today we're looking at the first two chapters on God and the soul, in other words, the supernatural. And our next session will talk about the Torah and religious law, and then finally our third session on Jewish identity in Israel. And if you're curious, you could get a copy of the book and read along if you want to. I'm happy to, share some of his insights and offer my own as we go through as well. No homework in our adult ed classes, but if you want to read it, it's Open Judaism by Barry Schwartz. So let's talk about God. There is definitely a traditional Jewish approach to God, and it's encapsulated in a text written by Maimonides in the 12th century of the Common Era. I see a question in the chat about the survey. I'd have to look in the footnotes, and I didn't check the footnotes. But my guess is it's within the last 10 or 15 years. And you see those kind of results whenever you do a survey of Jews and what they actually believe. They don't believe the traditional attitudes. So here's an example of Maimonides' version of what Jews should believe, specifically about a God. Maimonides' Principles of Faith. As I go through these, by the way, keep track of how many you say yes to and how many you might say no to. I believe with perfect faith that the Creator creates and directs all of the creations. He alone made, and will make everything. I believe with perfect faith the Creator is unique, and there is no uniqueness like his at all. I believe with perfect faith the Creator has no body, is unaffected by affections of the body, and there is no comparison to him. That the Creator is the first and the last. That the Creator, to him alone is it fitting to pray, and to none aside from him is it fitting to pray. Number 6, I believe with perfect faith that all the words of the prophets are the truth. That the prophecy of Moses, our rabbi, was the father of the prophets. He was the father of the prophets. His prophecy was true. And number 8, I believe with perfect faith that all of the Torah in our hands was given to Moses, our rabbi. that this Torah will not be exchanged and there will not be another Torah written by the Creator. Number 10, the Creator knows all the doings of humanity and all their thoughts. And therefore, it's just that in number 11, he rewards well those who keep his commandments and punishes those who break his commandments. I believe with perfect faith in the coming of a Messiah, and even though he tarries, even so I wait for him every day. And finally, I believe there will be a resurrection of the dead at the time the desire comes from the Creator. So these are core theological beliefs about humanity, about revelation, and about God that Maimonides decided was the core ideology of his version of Rabbinic Judaism. Now, there's some debate about which of these are subordinate to other ones. Other Jewish philosophers in the same era made a more condensed version of 6 or 3, but they all agree on believing in a God and believing in a real God, a God that's a personality, that intervenes in the world, that cares, that writes books, that rewards and punishes, that judges. All those characteristics that Schwartz described, that's a real God according to Jewish tradition. Now, it's worth asking the question, as Barry Schwartz does when talking about the traditional Jewish beliefs about God, why do people believe this? Now, some people try to use rational arguments to justify their beliefs, but it really becomes much more of a rationalization and after-the-fact justification than really why they actually believe. Here's how Schwartz describes it. Despite rationalist arguments, few people make up their minds based on reason alone. More likely, belief is based on experience and memory and emotions. Our background, how we grew up, is most influential. Our family, friends, community often play a decisive role. Our situation in life, our existential need to overcome loneliness and despair and find greater meaning and hope lead us to faith. It's not just rational arguments and logical proofs. It's also emotional need and attachments and upbringing and conditioning. So why we believe may not be a purely rational decision, even for the most traditional. Now, when Schwartz turns to talking about Jewish atheists and what do they think about God, well, you would think they have nothing to say, right? The answer is no. End of conversation. But actually, Schwartz tries to make a distinction between what he calls the hard atheist, whose answer is no, period, and what he calls the soft atheist. So, for example, he describes Spinoza, who had a belief that God was engaged in and literally immanent in the entire universe. It's called pantheism. Everything is part of God, so to speak, and God is revealed in the logical rules of how the universe runs. So it's not a God that writes a Torah, but it is a God that runs according to rational rules by being immanent in everything in the world. It's not clear this is a God that is a personality. In fact, most likely it wasn't, according to Spinoza. So he's an atheist towards the God of Jewish tradition, but he still uses the word God. Another example like that is the God of deism, which was very popular in the 17th and 18th century, coming out of the Enlightenment. It was a very popular opinion among many of our founding fathers. Some of them were Christians, for sure, but some of them were part of this deist movement. And here's how Schwartz summarizes deism. Deism posits that reason leads us to acknowledge that there is a supreme being that created the world. But reason also leads us to deny that God acts in supernatural ways that contradict natural law and observable evidence. So no miracles, no revelations. God is the celestial watchmaker who makes a watch called the universe, winds it up, and lets it tick. The God of the deists is real, but not personal. The God of the deists creates the world and sustains it through natural law, but does not interfere or intervene in that law. As an aside, Sherwin Wine, I thought, coined a very good phrase when he said that the God of deism is like a deity emeritus. You know, he started it and then he retired and he's not in his office very much, doesn't check his mail, and it's hard to reach him by the phone. And, you know, he's sort of in the background. Started it, let it run, and it's on its own. He retired. Now, maybe that works as a God concept, but it's hard to use that kind of a God concept of deism to maintain a conventional religious identity, because so much of conventional religion is talking to a God and praying to a God and thanking a God and reading the words of the God as if they were written by a real God with all those traditional characteristics. So then you have the middle ground group. Remember, the book is for believers, atheists, and agnostics. So his third group are where he generally puts liberal religions like Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, Reconstructionist Judaism, or as it calls itself today, Reconstructing Judaism. They're trying to save the God language in some way. They don't believe in all those traditional principles. They believe in maybe some of them, or they believe in something more than the natural world. They're not just materialists. Remember, Spinoza could be just a materialist who puts a little flavor on the natural world, and the hard atheist says it's just material things. The religious liberal wants there to be something more than just material things. So one of the strategies that was followed by Mordechai Kaplan, who founded Reconstructing Judaism in the 1930s, and then ultimately sparked his own movement in the 1960s and 70s, Kaplan decided he wanted to reinterpret the God concept. Here's Schwartz's summary of Kaplan. Kaplan did not accept traditional ideas of revelation or miracles that would contradict scientific understanding of the natural order. God is not all-powerful, omnipotent, or all-knowing, omniscient. God is the source of goodness, so benevolent. Kaplan shied away from describing God as a personal being, preferring representations such as source, force, power, or quality. God remains the transcendent, creative, and moral force of the universe. God is the source of what makes us the most human: love, courage, morality, creativity. God is, quote, all the relationships, tendencies, and agencies which in their totality go to make human life worthwhile in the deepest and most abiding sense. The word God, he wrote, has thus come to be symbolically expressive of the highest ideals for which men strive, and at the same time points to the objective fact that the world is so constituted as to make for the realization of those ideas. Did you catch that? So God is this force behind the universe. It's all the positive tendencies that make us the most human. God is love, God is courage, God is morality and creativity. God is what makes life worthwhile. Is God a you? Do you say you to love, to courage? Well, maybe in poetry. But after a while, you begin to wonder, who am I talking to? Is this the same God that's described in the Hebrew Bible? Because after all, that God walks in the Garden of Eden in the cool of the afternoon. That God gets mad. That God regrets destroying the world with the flood. I don't know that love regrets. I don't know that love destroys the world in a flood. I don't know that love writes a Torah. So what you wind up doing in this world of redefinitions is you want to keep the God, but you have to shift it. So maybe God is not a personality, but it's a force. Or maybe you become, in the words of one Reform rabbi, Roland Gittleson, you become a religious naturalist. Here's a quote from Gittleson. I don't believe that God is a person or a discrete being. I believe God is a force, an intelligence, a power within the universe and within all being. To be sure, I often pray as if God were a person, because there is no other way to conceive of him when praying. But I don't ask God for miracles. Even when my father and later my first wife were dying, I never prayed to God for miracles. I prayed that it might be possible within the laws of nature for my father or my wife to recover. I prayed that if it were not possible, each of them should die as painlessly and quickly as possible. I prayed that I might have the strength to survive whatever trauma was involved, and that I might be able to go through the experience to help other people in similar situations. So God is a force. Do you talk to gravity? Does it make sense to praise magnetism? It's very useful. It's very helpful. but I don't know that it meets that need for a personal God. And notice the phrase he used, I pray as if God were a person. And to my experience, a lot of liberal religious practice is as if. I want to live this world. I want to recite these words. I want to have these emotional feelings as if that being were there, even if on a rational sense, I'm not sure it's there. I mean, a God that's deduced from the human experience is not the same. That's a God we need to be there, but that doesn't mean it's there. It's a God that we're projecting from our needs. You know, I need my parent to be loving. So even if they're abusive, I'm going to blame myself rather than blame the parent for what they're terribly doing to me. Judging the truth by what we need is not a way to find the truth. In the end, there's a limit to redefining everything. You try and apply that God term to the stories in the Hebrew Bible, it doesn't make any sense. And so either you believe in a very different God that should be called something different, or you have to admit the discontinuity with the past. At the end of the section on God, Schwartz offers the following anecdote. In synagogues throughout the world, including my own, a verse from the Talmud is inscribed above the ark. Da lifnei mi ata omed, know before whom you stand. Whatever our denominational label, he claims, we can relate to the teaching. We understand the verse to mean that we stand before something transcendent, beyond ourselves. Some call this God, others the universe, others the community, or even the generations of our family or people. But it calls us to a certain mindfulness and humility toward the one beyond ourselves. My question for Schwartz would be, would you accept an edit to that line? Instead of saying, Da lifnei mi ata omed, know before whom you stand, what about Da lifnei ma ata omed, know before what you stand? After all, if we're relating to the universe, if we're relating to the community, if we're relating to humanity as a whole or the natural world, is it okay to say what instead of whom? Is that enough for the sense of transcendent being part of something beyond ourselves, even in a natural way? And is there a possibility for a natural transcendence? So that's Schwartz's approach to God, describing it from a traditional perspective, what an atheist might think, and somewhere in the middle, where liberal Jewish denominations like Reform or Conservative might land. So at this point, I thought maybe I'll stop and we could talk a bit about that, maybe your experience of what you've heard from other Jewish communities, or your own experience, and what you think about that question of, is there a God? What does that God mean? Does it even matter to explore the question? And what do Jews think about that question? Was muted. Yeah.
Another way of thinking about that question is there a God that exists independent of my experience of him or her or it? Because I actually think number one, it's often useful construct, which in and of itself doesn't make it something that exists independent of my like in my opinion, God exists between my ears, or one's ears. But I think we're also, as a result of natural selection, genetically inclined to have those kinds of beliefs. In the same way that we're, human beings are inclined to play soccer because there are basic components to soccer that serve adaptive functions, like being able to run, being able to be coordinated, to cooperate, to be competitive, all these things that we can see how we were sort of over the many millennia were built into our genes to have those capacities and propensities. And so lo and behold, we come up with soccer, which is sort of a secondary result of those basic tendencies. I think God is like that. There are some basic things that actually are adaptive. And then those have been sort of usurped and ended up being put together into belief in God and spirits and heaven and all these other sorts of things.
In architecture, they describe something called a spandrel. A spandrel is an unintentional thing that's created by doing something else. So you build a staircase, it creates a space under the staircase that you can make into a closet or something else. That's the spandrel. This is space under the staircase. So maybe we believe in in evolution too, of course, because sometimes you have features that help with some issues and don't help with others. So you get famously sickle cell anemia is a side effect to an adaptation that helps you survive malaria. So it's an unintentional consequence. So in cognitive theory, the thought is that perhaps we believe in causation. And so we imagine that the flood was caused by something. It's good if you can think about sequence of things, but it doesn't mean that an agent is doing it necessarily. If you see leaves rustle on a tree, it's good if you imagine that it's a leopard about to jump on you, because if it is a leopard and you run, then you're safe. If it's not, and you ran for nothing, you're still safe. So it may be that some of these pieces of our brain that were helpful in some ways get combined into believing in a God concept that then takes on a life of its own. I did want to share with you one thing I should have done earlier, which is how many Jews actually believe in a God? So this is from the 2020 Pew survey of American Jews. And they asked, do you believe in the God of the Bible? Do you believe in some other kind of higher power or spiritual force, or do you not believe in either one? So believe in the God of the Bible, it's 26%. That would be what Schwartz calls the believers. Do you believe in another higher power or spiritual force? That would be what he calls the agnostics. It's about 50%. But then 22% of American Jews said they don't believe in either one. Those are the hardcore, I just don't believe. And notice, by the way, when you compare those numbers of 26, 50, and 22 to the general American population, of all U.S. adults, 56% believe in the God of the Bible, compared to only 26% for Jews. A third of American Jews believe in the higher power spiritual force, compared to half of, of all Americans believe in that, compared to half of American Jews. And then don't believe in either one, the hardcore atheists, only 10% of U.S. adults, compared to 22% of Jews. So we are much more likely to be much more skeptical than the general population, especially when it comes to the question of a God. Any other thoughts, comments on the God question? There's an extended comment here from Michael. There's an intriguing midrash questioning the idea of a God affectable by human actions, the personal God. What is the impact of this text within traditional Judaism? God basically says, do you really think I care about how you slaughter animals? Well, look, you can look at the line in Isaiah where he says, is this the fast I've chosen to afflict your body, or is the point to do justice and to how you affect other people? And the reality is that you can find a rabbinic source on either side of any issue. You'll get some that say, we don't listen to the divine voice from heaven. And then there are others where the divine voice from heaven is what decides the legal issue. When you have a diverse tradition that isn't necessarily trying to be consistent in our categories of philosophy and reason, they're going to come up with those kind of ambiguities. But it's a fair point to ask, would a God really care about this? I mean, people have sometimes wondered if Maimonides actually believed all 13 of his 13 principles of faith himself. Because if you read some of his philosophical writings, particularly The Guide for the Perplexed, he casts doubt on some of the principles that he put in his list of 13 principles of faith. So the answer to that is generally, well, I guess you have your Maimonides and I have my Maimonides. Jessica, were you going to add something?
No, I just like your pun there.
Okay, good.
Maimonides. I do have a lot to add, but I'm editing.
Okay.
I'm listening tonight.
That's fine. Anyone else before Chet goes twice? Okay, Chet, go ahead.
I always wonder when if a professional athlete, say a professional basketball player, is praying to God to win the game, and then if he does, he thanks God for winning. But there's probably somebody on the other team that was also praying to God to win the game. and whoever's team won, then they thank God. I wonder how many people think that God really has preferences. Unless God, it goes to Vegas and has some bets on the game, I would think he wouldn't have a lot of preferences.
So there was one incident I remember where a receiver for the Buffalo Bills dropped the winning touchdown catch at the end of the game and they lost the game. And then he went on Twitter and he said, God, why'd you do me like that? I praise you 24/7. Still love you, though. It's the only time I've ever seen someone actually draw the legal, sort of the logical sequence out of, well, if I dropped it, then he wanted me to do that. And he made me drop, and he's making me feel terrible. But you very rarely hear that from the athletes.
He got a lot of criticism for that too.
He did. He did.
So, but what I always, just on what Chet was saying, what I always wonder about sometimes is, so there's a tornado and it bounces and knocks off this neighbor's house and it jumps over this guy's house and destroys 2 more houses and kills people. And the people that survive are always saying, thank God he protected me. And I always think to myself, but he hated the guy next door. I mean, it's like, it's just the selection of these things that are seem to be random events. And people bring this, personal into it. It just makes me crazy.
Schwartz actually talks about a book that addresses this kind of a question. It's called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. It's by a conservative rabbi named Harold Kushner. It's a huge worldwide bestseller, written in 1981, gone through a gazillion printings. Notice the title, though. It's not why bad things happen to good people. It's when bad things happen to good people, because bad things happen to good people. And that's what he starts with. In fact, he himself began the idea of writing this book because his son had a disease called, I think it's called progenera, where you age really quickly. And he died, I think, at age 14, something like that. And so what Kushner wrote at the beginning of his book that Schwartz quotes here, I believe in God, but I do not believe the same things about him I did years ago when I was growing up. I recognize his limitations. He's limited in what he can do by the laws of nature and by the evolution of human nature and human moral freedom. I no longer hold God responsible for illnesses, accidents, and natural disasters, because I gain little and I lose so much when I blame God for those things. I can worship a God who hates suffering but cannot eliminate it more easily than I can worship a God who chooses to make children suffer and die for whatever exalted reason. So his God hates suffering but can't fix it. I sometimes describe Kushner's God as like the cheerleader who...
Yeah, is that a God? Is that
right,
a God?
that's the question. Is that a real God? Is that really a God? But, the cheerleader on the side of the field can't throw the pass, can't make the tackle, doesn't even design the plays, right? But the cheerleader can encourage you, can give you extra strength you didn't know you had, can make you feel better when you come off the field, right? So, I mean, you could believe in a God that's a cheerleader. That's certainly fine. I guess my question is why you're still calling him king.
So a couple of months ago, I read a book called Why There Is No God I'm looking at Avim Navabi, because this has been going on in my life for 45 years. And, people are always sort of like, well, what this and that, and why don't you treat your children to Christmas? And, oh, God blessed me. And one, it's not my place to provide the evidence. It's your place to provide the evidence because you're saying something exists that is not provable, right? So it's like a legal argument, but it's like the most important argument. It's like you can't make up stuff and then support it with other made up stuff. So I'm not an attorney, but I am a scientist, and that doesn't make sense. But to Chet's point about the people winning, and this is the part I hate about football. I turn it off right after they win because they're always like, oh, thank God for this, because the other team was also very religious and worried about being hurt. But there's no explanation for why bad things happen to other people who also believed in God and who were also praying in the exact same way. And so, it all fundamentally comes down to a lack of evidence but it also is just not logical to me. And it's not, there's nothing saying that like a spiritual being has to be logical. And that's why I go slightly towards the agnostic, because there's so much we don't know. But it's also like, how can you just pin everything on this when the other team, who's full of the same people praying for the exact same outcomes, didn't get it, and so they're all unworthy? And is this just like a
Well, and sometimes
crapshoot?
it can be, and it can become very self-destructive. Some
Right.
of the ultra-Orthodox communities that survived terrible, terrible trauma during the Holocaust turned it on themselves. And they said it must have been, if we suffered, we must have done wrong. If God is just and intervenes in the world and causes things to happen, and we suffered terribly, we must have done something wrong. And so now we're going to make those walls with the outside world even higher. And we're going to make the skirts even longer and the sleeves on the women even longer. And we're going to, study even harder and fast even more intensely, because we must have messed up. And it's blaming yourself, for the suffering. You're the victim of an indifferent universe, and you're blaming yourself. But they would rather have a world that makes sense where it's their fault than have a world that doesn't make sense, that doesn't have someone writing the story and driving the ship. We, on the other hand, can live with a world that doesn't have someone writing the story or driving the ship. That has its challenges too. We don't have guarantees that things will turn out well. Of course, they don't either, but we know that we don't have any guarantees that things will turn out well. And we have to make the most of the time that we have. I saw Dory was unmuted for a minute, and then I see Laurie has his hand up also. And then we want to move on to the soul after that.
Being an atheist is very poorly looked upon. Like, people cannot tolerate that you might not believe in some sort of, superior being. It's really very offensive. It isn't just, oh, I don't feel the same. Any thoughts?
Well, sure. The social stigma of not believing in the emperor's new clothes is definitely a challenge. But the reality is that, first of all, it's become less of a stigma these days. More people are willing to admit their doubts, if not, take on that atheist label. I mean, even as a movement, we call ourselves humanistic because we prefer to use a positive belief system rather than define ourselves by what we're not, just like the reform movement doesn't call itself the anti-kosher movement, or, they're going to define themselves by their positive value of progressive or reform. So we similarly take a positive approach of what we do believe. I think that the other challenge will be that people are worried about atheists for two reasons. One is, are you questioning what I think is the organizing principle of the universe? And secondly, how can you be good if nobody's watching you? And if you don't think somebody's watching you? And it's a more authoritarian approach to ethics. In some ways, our approach to ethics actually takes more faith in people, because we believe that people can be good without eternal judgment, punishment, and surveillance. Elf on a Shelf is just one more version of cosmic reward and punishment. But people can be good without that. At least we hope so. We have experience that shows it can be true. The right circumstances, the right education, the right reinforcement, we can make positive ethical progress. And we've been doing it for centuries. It's not like you have to start from scratch, right? People have been doing ethics without revealed religion for centuries. And so we learn from that, and we build on that and do our best to inculcate compassion for each other and the willingness to lead our own lives. Sorry, Laura, you had a last comment.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe
Oh, yeah.
atheist gets, it feels the equivalent as amoral. Like,
Right.
you can't possibly have morals if you don't believe in a God.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because religion has always only done ethical things.
Right. Yeah. I just wanted to say, you mentioned, that every group around the world has had religion, and I think that that's pretty much true. It depends on how you define it, of course, because obviously a lot of groups are animist and, have spirits and ancestors that are part of their world and so forth.
Right.
But But I think that there is a don't talk on talking. I think that there is a need for humans to understand the world and have some way in which they can explain what's happening, because random is, things that happen randomly are difficult to process at some point, because you don't feel like you have no control. Ultimately, I think that religion becomes an instrument of the people who run your society to keep people in line. And and what happened in recent centuries is that we have replaced religion, some of us, with science. So now we have an order of things that happen according to scientific rules or natural rules, and we accept that instead of just randomness, in a sense. But I think there's always that sense of needing to understand the world around us and why things happen, rather than just saying, oh gosh, another bad thing happened or another good thing happened. Anyway, that's my thought there.
Well, look, religion fits a lot of boxes, right? You are explaining why and how things happen. You are providing a moral structure and an enforcement mechanism. You are providing comfort to explain why this tragedy took place. It's checking a lot of boxes. And one of the insights of humanistic Judaism is that those human needs that religion meets continue even if you don't believe in the religious answers. You still need to answer questions of how to be a good person and why do things happen and how can I deal with the tragedies of my life and where do I get the power to solve problems. And those are all things that religion offers, more or less reliably, but we still have to find a way to answer it. And in terms of social control, look, Marx famously said that religion was the opiate of the masses, and the Soviet Union was famously anti-communist, as Alan points out in the chat. And that was another stigma that was added to it. So in the end, we have our beliefs, as I mentioned, the belief that people can be good without a cosmic policeman. But one of the things that is hard to prove and hard to disprove, and therefore lives in that sort of gray area of maybe or a choice of different vocabulary to describe the same thing, is the idea of a soul. Is there a soul? Where is it? How is it? How do you find it? And so in Jewish tradition, there is a concept that there was some kind of a soul. Is it what makes us unique? Are people inherently good or evil? Is the soul eternal? Is there an afterlife? Now, many people claim that Jews don't believe in an afterlife. And it is true that some Jews don't believe in an afterlife. But Judaism as a religious tradition absolutely has an afterlife concept in it. If you read the book of Daniel in chapter 12, it clearly describes a resurrection at the end of days where people are brought back to life. If you read the Talmud, which is the earliest, one of the earliest collections of rabbinic sayings, you've got the Mishnah, which was compiled around 200 CE, and the commentary to the Mishnah called the Gemara, together make the Talmud, finished about 600 CE. There are a lot of passages that clearly refer to an afterlife. In the Siddur, the prayer book, some of the prayers clearly refer to an afterlife, a resurrection of the dead, a time of judgment. Here's one passage from the Talmud that Barry Schwartz cites. Here's the quote. There will be three groups on the day of judgment, one of thoroughly righteous people, one of thoroughly wicked people, and one of people in between. The first group will be inscribed for everlasting life. The second will be doomed in Gehinnom, a kind of underworld. The third will go down to Gehinnom and suffer and rise again. If it sounds a lot like heaven, hell, and purgatory, well, early rabbinic Judaism gave birth to Christianity. They got it somewhere, right? But it's also maintained in Jewish life. Remember, Maimonides' last principle was the resurrection of the dead. So in the traditional approach, the believers category in Schwartz's taxonomy, there clearly is a belief in Jewish life among those Jews that are most traditional that there is a soul and that there is an afterlife. And it's an individual afterlife that you get resurrected, whether it's resurrected into a body or in some kind of eternal spiritual plane. There's some disagreement about that, but there's also even arguments about whether the dead are resurrected in clothing or naked. And where are they resurrected? One of the reasons why Orthodox Jews over the centuries wanted to get buried in Israel, because the belief was that that's where the resurrection will happen. And what if you happen to be buried not in the land of Israel? Well, then your body will roll in underground tunnels all the way to Israel and then pop up right there. There's a whole, quote, science of the resurrection. But many Jews don't believe that. Even back in the time of the Bible and the Talmud, some Jews didn't believe it. And Schwartz goes on to quote some examples of Jewish sources that doubt it. In the book of Genesis, it says, "Dust you are, and to dust you return." No resurrection there. The book of Ecclesiastes says, "In respect of the fate of man and the fate of beast, they have one and the same fate. Both go to the same place, both came from dust, and both return to dust." The end. So even historically, there have been Jews who believed in an afterlife and Jews who did not believe in an afterlife. But the question is there a soul separate from the concept of an afterlife? And can you have a secular version of a soul? Well, one possibility that Schwartz offers is the idea that you relate to someone on the individual level in a deep, meaningful way, and that can feel like your soul is touching their soul. You have a soulmate, or you're having a soul-to-soul connection. When you look in someone else's eyes and you're talking to them directly and you're having a very deep interface with them, that can be a very meaningful process. And Martin Buber describes this in his philosophy as an I-thou relationship. Instead of treating someone like an it, a thing to be used and discarded, you relate to them as a fully sentient, conscious, inherently worthy being. And that's an interpersonal relationship. Now, for Buber, he also has God as what he calls the eternal thou, but you can still have that interpersonal dynamic. Or you might find that there's part of you that connects to the world around you in a deep way, and that's meaningful more than you expected. It's what you might call a natural transcendence. I need to find the quote here. Oh, there we go. He actually quotes Sherwin Wine, one of our founding thinkers, on explaining a natural transcendence. And you might find this reflects your experience. And maybe this is a moment where you feel like, oh, this is something more than just my material body at work here. When we feel insignificant in the midst of a vast and overwhelming universe, but feel significant as a part of a single nature evolving through the ages. When we feel insignificant as a lonely and mortal individual, but feel significant as part of a centuries-long chain of family love. When we see ourselves as powerless fighting the forces of evil alone, but see ourselves as powerful when joined together with others in a movement of political idealism, we experience the wonder of natural transcendence. You're part of something larger than yourself. Even if it's a concept, a natural world, it's still something beyond your individual experience, biology, physical limitations. Whether you call that a soul, that's debatable. So what about those middle ground people, that liberal Jewish perspective? What do they think about immortality and the soul? After all, someone has to be those Jews who don't believe in an afterlife. Well, I'll show you a couple of examples. One of them comes from the earliest platform of Reform Judaism. It's called the Pittsburgh Platform, issued in 1885. And in that Pittsburgh Platform, they highlight a very interesting series of beliefs. It's worth reading on its own light, certainly for the way they talk about God, among other concepts. But here's what they have to say about the soul. And this is number 7. We reassert the doctrine of Judaism that the soul is immortal, grounding the belief on the divine nature of human spirit, which forever finds bliss in righteousness and misery in wickedness. We reject, as ideas not rooted in Judaism, the beliefs both in bodily resurrection and in Gehenna and Eden, hell and paradise, as abodes for everlasting punishment and reward. I'll just point out the Talmud did talk about Gehenna, right? In fact, even this document uses the Jewish term for hell and for heaven, Gehenna and Eden. or Eden. But they still believe in some kind of immortal soul, whatever that means. And they give a justification for it, not based on faith, but giving a proof based on the fact that people like good things and reject bad things. That must mean the soul is immortal in some way. Or here's another example from a 1988 statement by the conservative movement of their principles called Emet ve'emunah, truth and faith. And so this describes what they think about the end of life and what happens afterwards. For the individual human being, we affirm, let me just zoom in a little bit, we affirm that death does not mean extinction and oblivion. This conviction is articulated in our tradition in the two doctrines of the bodily resurrection of the dead and the continued existence after death and through eternity of the individual soul. In the course of our history, both of these doctrines have been understood in widely varying ways. For some of us, they are literal truths that enable us to confront death and the death of our loved ones with courage and equanimity. Others understand these teachings in a more figurative way. The doctrine of the resurrection of the dead, omnipresent in our liturgy, affirms the value Judaism accords to our bodily existence in our concrete setting. Beyond this, we know that our genetic makeup will persist through our progeny long after our deaths and as long as humankind survives. So they give you a supernatural option, but they also give you a naturalist option, that you can live forever for your progeny. The immortality of the soul affirms that our identities and our ability to touch other people does not end with the physical death of our bodies. Great personalities remain potent influences in the world. Our friends and the members of our families who are gone are still palpably alive for us to this day. That's how they understand the immortality of the soul, is that people remember you. So it's really sort of wanting to have your cake and eat it too, to have your physical resurrection, your immortal spiritual soul, but also, just in case you don't believe that, here are some other comforts that fit in what we might call a more naturalistic, humanistic approach. On this question of the soul, a humanistic perspective is that, as far as we know, our consciousness lives in our brain signals. And when those end, our individual consciousness will end. But that doesn't mean that life is meaningless. In fact, it means that life is that much more meaningful while we're here. And if you take the sum total of our thoughts, our feelings, our experiences, our mind, our memory, do you call that a soul? Do you just call it yourself? Does it mean you here and now? Well, that's who we are. One of my favorite summations of our approach to this question is coined, as far as I know, by humanist Rabbi Greg Epstein, where he said in his book, Good Without God, humanists believe in life before death. And that works for me. Yes, Jessica.
Hi. This is an interesting point for me because I'm a physician and I have often been around patients on death's bed or in comatose states, and I'm never not certain when they are dead. You know, it's like there's something that's changed and it's not on the monitor. It's not, you know, there's something that's different. And so this is why I've always been kind of like more on the agnostic side, because there's this strange thing that I cannot reason away. And I can't, and I've spent 30 something years trying to get to the bottom of what is it? It's not just the eyes. Sometimes their eyes will be closed. So there's that. So just like a point of like,
Yeah,
there is something that we do not understand scientifically yet that remains to be explored. But then also, I remember when I was younger reading about the Jewish concept of like a bank of souls, being like where there are a bunch of birds that come in and out. This might have been more on the like Kabbalah kind of side, but and they're sort of like recycled through.
Well, there's
So I
this
always find
concept.
that kind of an interesting way to think about it. But
It's like a
those are my
karma
2
rebirth.
points. Is one is like,
Yeah.
I know when someone has died, whether their eyes are open, regardless of what the monitor, if they're on a monitor or not, I know they're not there anymore. And then the other one is like, I've often thought about this soul bank.
Yeah. Well, there's a concept in certain parts of Jewish thought of what's called Gilgul, which is from the word like a circle. It's a reincarnation idea, just like you have karma and you have reincarnation in Eastern religions, or from our perspective, Eastern and Asian religions. You also have a strand of Jewish thought that believes in some kind of reincarnation idea. Or even that people who were not Jewish, who become Jewish, were actually born with a Jewish soul, and they were one of the 600,000 souls that were at Sinai that's getting recirculated. And, that's all unverifiable, undisprovable, and, poetic thinking maybe. One of the interesting features in Hebrew language is that the word for soul and the word for breath are the same. Neshama, right? And think about that phrase when somebody gave up the ghost. The idea that they had that last breath, and then that's the life force that's leaving them. One of the ways you check if someone's still alive is you actually hold a feather under their nose. This is part of rabbinic medicine or medicine. And so there's all these connections between breathing, and the soul. But if you're thinking about the soul in a naturalistic way, as inspiration, as meditation, uplift, psychology even, thinking about the importance of breath in that process, anyone who does meditation has to work on breathing. That's where you start, because first of all, if you're not breathing, you're not thinking very well. No, there's no breath holding meditation as far as I know. But it's also that rhythm that, the body and the mind are much more closely related than we realize. And so creating a rhythm with your breathing relaxes parts of your mind as well. And so that relationship of inspiration, spirituality, and simply breathing is encapsulated in that Hebrew term that neshama can be breath and soul, whatever that means to you.
I don't know if there's any more physicians on here, but I've talked to several physicians about this whole concept of they're not on a respirator, they're not monitored, but they're dead, that intangible sort of element that, I want to debunk, but I haven't been able to. So,
well, look, it may be that, well, do you remember the story of Mr. It wasn't Mr. Ed. It was some horse that was thought to be amazing because it could do math. And so you would ask the horse the math question and it would tap its hoof and it always got the right answer. And then someone thought, well, let's put the horse behind a screen and ask the question. It couldn't get the right answer because what it was doing was watching the people for their
picking up on
involuntary
subtle cues, yeah.
Right, the subtle cues that we didn't even notice. And so it may be that there are those subtle cues in a soon-to-be body, in someone who's dying, that our rational brain doesn't pick out, but we still notice in some way. I mean, I'll give you one other example, and I have no rational explanation for this, but how many times are you looking at someone from the back or the side and they turn to look at you? It's like they know someone's looking at them, or you feel someone's looking at you, turn and look, and then they look away, but they were looking, these are parts of our brain that were our social awareness, maybe out of the corner of our eye, we saw something that didn't register consciously, but is in there somewhere. It's evolutionary advantageous to know if somebody's watching you, right? For social reputation and all kinds of factors. So maybe there are parts of our perception of other beings that we simply haven't quantified yet. I like your use of the yet, because that really is the scientific mindset. Not that we could never know, or there's no way to prove it, but as far as we know now, this is what we know. And
there are a lot of
Yeah.
elements of, like, I can meet a person and I know a million things about their health already because of all of these things that I've been trained to observe consciously and subconsciously. But it's kind of interesting you focused on breathing, because there's this agonal breathing that occurs right before death. So
Mhm.
that's kind of interesting that, you know, even in modern medicine, there is also the kind of the education and the awareness of this agonal breathing pattern that precedes death. But the reason why I want to debunk it is because even when people don't have this agonal breathing pattern, I've known this. So
So any other, yeah, Chet, go ahead.
You know, a lot of things it just don't really interest me that much about, did God really create the earth and do this? Is it in 7 days? To me, those all fall under the heading of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. I feel like those were fairly well resolved for me by the time I was 12. And I've spent the subsequent 6 years slowly making my way back, but in a way that is consistent with the basic metaphysics of what I believe is the way the universe works. And so for me, the way I've done it is, I don't think of religion as answering questions about science or about history. Um, it's more poetry. And I think a lot of religious terms do have, I mean, as I'm a psychologist also, so I think a lot of religious terms have psychological truth to them. But that doesn't mean that they tell truths about how the world got to be here, or about, you know, or any of that kind of thing. Right. So I think the soul is a very useful construct, but it's more poetic. I would say the same thing is true for love. Ghosts. There's a great psychoanalytic writer who talks about the essence of psychoanalysis is to convert ghosts into ancestors. In other words, when you're haunted by people from your past, to be able to stop being haunted by them, but to now just understand them as people who were in your past. Well, that's a beautiful use of the term ghost. But I don't take it literally that, you know, there's somebody, like there's a ghost wandering around in my attic or something. Purgatory, redemption. You can go on and on and on through all these religious terms. And I do think that most of them really do have meaning. They have psychological meaning to them, even if there isn't an actual external reference I mean, you're never going to find a soul in an MRI or an fMRI. It's just not, you're not going to find it.
Yeah.
It doesn't make it not useful.
So I guess our dilemma then becomes, what do we do with this Jewish tradition and all these traditional sources that really meant it when they were talking about a soul or a God or a creator or a judge or a revealer? You know, I mean, they meant it. We see it as a metaphor, maybe, but maybe we have to write our own poetry with this. We have to, you know, be willing to not just accept it as the past, as if the past meant what we meant by those words. Or, as Chet was alluding to, maybe we try to extract what's the insight into the human condition that this text, legend, imagery offers. You know, when God's creating Adam and realizes, in Hebrew, it's lo tov heyot adam levado. It's not good for a human being to be alone. I don't believe that's how people became male and female, but it's absolutely true. It is not good for people to be alone. We didn't know it before 2020. We know it now, right? So there's a human insight in that. It's a kind of poetic truth to the text, separate from any ontological claim for reality. But here's where we're maybe more hardcore on the topic. We want to be clear when we're doing poetry and when we're doing truth, because
Right.
Others are more willing to live in the ambiguity, the as if. They'll talk about creation as a real event, even if we know they don't mean it literally, and they certainly don't want it taught in science classes. What we're willing to do is to take the science class and bring it into the synagogue and say, what if we talked about evolution as the real story of how we came to be? And the creation story as a legend that talks about who we are and how we work with each other. It's the insight of literature. It's not the same as a claim to reality. So I hope you enjoyed this dive through. We can answer some last questions in just a minute. I just wanted to let you know if you did want to sign out because we're at an hour or so. Our next sessions will be on the Torah and religious law. What do other Jews think about that? What do we think about that? And then our third session will be on Jewish identity in Israel, certainly a hot topic these days, and certainly plenty of Jewish division over that question, even more to the forefront now than it was before. Laura, you were going to jump in on something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing really fast. And what many years ago, I came to this question, which was, if there's a soul, how do we explain it scientifically? Because it violates particle theory and everything we know about science. And and so for me, I get all the poetry and the all these other issues, but when it comes to actual souls and ghosts and things, like, they exist in a realm that doesn't exist as far as we understand science.
Yeah.
So,
well, that's the poetic shift of what rings true to the human experience versus what is true in the real world. And maybe that's the line to split.
Okay, I don't want to keep talking, but okay. You
Yeah,
know,
you do.
I'm finding it I have found it very helpful to to think of it in terms of different ways of different processing systems that human beings have. There's a processing system that we use in order to pay our taxes, take care of business at work, cut the lawn, do our bills, all that sort of thing. And then there's another processing system that is involved in having experiences that we could call religious or poetic, seeing a beautiful sunset and all that sort of thing. And I think that actually, this is not my idea. I stole this from some very smart people, but that religion is basically a collection of people who are organized to help the individuals in that group pursue experiences of the divine. And by experiences of the divine, I mean that in a religious naturalist way. Not that there's anything, there is nothing in the world that has the intrinsic property of divinity. Divinity is something that occurs between your ears and you project it onto whether it's activity, the building, the article of clothing, the person or whatever. I think it's a good thing to be pursuing those kinds of experiences, meaning trying to strengthen that processing system, knowing that, like Martin Buber said, you want I-thou relationships, but you can't live without I-it relationships.
Right. I sometimes will make a distinction between a rational experience, an anti-rational experience, which is the intentionally supernaturally understood, and the non-rational experience that's emotive without analyzing it. Hearing the symphony without counting the beats, appreciating the rainbow without measuring the spectrum. And there are times that we need to do both rational and non-rational things because we, as beings, are both rational and non-rational. And so, cultivating the emotive, expressive side of who we are is also very human, just as analysis is.